a trial by jury, and the determination of the jurors shall not be re-examined in any court of the United States. The Ninth Amendment is excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. The 14th Amendment is powerful. That's another civil rights amendment. And another due process of law amendment. And about the 14th Amendment, Section 3 says, if any judge or a police officer or anybody else violates his oath of office, that person, the government is no longer required to pay that person. That's bad enough. But the fourth section is that that person loses his pension. Now, violating the oath means what? Violating the Constitution of the United States of America. Those amendments that we just discussed. I just heard a snowplow. This must be snow number 18. And in the meantime, I started writing another show. This show was called the SS Glendora. I was the skipper, and the little children were the mates. They were the sailors. And it was a really well-written show. And my mother and I and my father, we all worked together, and we made the props. We made epaulets for their shoulders and had gold stripes on them, and my mother covered them with black cloth and sewed a gold-like button on the tip, and then my father, and then sewed the gold ribbon to give their rank. And I researched about ships, and it really had a very good flavor. And it was a very well-written show. And I started to peddle that. And I did find a buyer, Hervey Carter. Hervey, H-E-R-V-E-Y Carter, Manchester, New Hampshire. General Manager of WMUR TV, MUR standing for Governor Murphy, who owned the station, Channel 9, Manchester, New Hampshire. And he bought the show, Hervey Carter did. I believe I was paid $75 a week to do it. Can you imagine that? I had made up my mind in Los Angeles that if you're going to start out in television, Los Angeles and New York is not the place to do it because you do not have the experience. It takes considerable experience to go on television and talk to a camera. And I was getting that experience little by little. I was a long way from being good at it, but I could keep the show going. And there were no videotapes. The film, of course, was out of the question. Although, I'll have to tell you about that later. It's not this year, it's the next year. And so the show was to start up in September, and it did. And we had a sponsor, Donald Duck Bread. They liked my show right away because it had been sponsored. It had been sponsored in Pittsfield. And of course, that's all they were looking for was sponsors. So it looked like this show could find sponsors. The sales department could sell it. And so we started up in the fall of '54 in Manchester, New Hampshire. And there was a huge mansion on the corner of Elm Street and the road and Route 3, which went to Concord, New Hampshire. And this Chinese man had bought it because he wanted to start a Chinese restaurant. They had been very mean to him somewhere and done him out of his former Chinese restaurant. His name was Lee. I rented the 3rd floor. Huge, huge room. And the toilet, the water for the toilet was in a wooden box, and it was above the toilet, and there was a long chain. And to flush, you'd pull the chain. It was really old-fashioned. But there I was, and on the air every day, planning my show, planning the games to play with the kids, planning the jokes, planning the activities, planning the commercials. And I was doing it, and it was fun. And I graduated from 1 show a week to 5 shows a week, from 15 minutes a day to 45 minutes a day, and from UHF to VHF. VHF, very high frequency, Channel 9. There was a very rainy day in October. It rained, and it rained, and it rained, and it rained, and the wind blew. And the wind blew down the television station's antenna. So there was no transmitter. There was no transmission. It was off the air. It was soon fixed. But I have to go back and tell you that poor Mr. Podolsky, the weather was so mean to him. And I believe 3 times the Berkshire winds blew down his antenna on Mount Greylock. It's fierce. Fierce, fierce, fierce. What an experience. The people there, too. I remember the people. I remember working there, going to work every morning at 9 and leaving at 5. So, in the meantime, Franklyn Buell was bringing me back and forth to Manchester. And then I found out when he deposited my checks from Pittsfield television station, he added money to them. He gave me money, and he put it in the bank. And Franklyn and I would periodically go down and see his mother and father, Ernest and Daisy Buell. Daisy Feber Buell. Grandpa Feber was an immigrant. I believe he came from Bavaria.
Yes, Bavaria.
Over near Austria. And he worked in a factory there in East Hampton.
East Hampton.
And he worked there many years. And Grandpa Feber and Grandma Feber moved to Middletown, Connecticut, where Wesleyan College was, but it's now Wesleyan University. Ivy League on the Connecticut River. And Grandpa Feber lived to within days, a few days of his 100th birthday. He died at 99, and he lived with Franklyn, his mother and father, in Terryville, Connecticut. Terryville, Connecticut, Eagle Lock. Much industry and machinery all around that area. In fact, all of New England.
Not
Factories.
anymore.
And Daisy Buell was a very good mother. And she had 4 sons, Morris, Vincent, Lawrence, and Franklyn. Morris was a radio operator. When radio first came out, he played with it, and he really cut himself into a great career. He was an engineer for WTIC Hartford. And then before that, he was an engineer for the United Fruit Company. What did you call that? Morse code telegrapher. And Vincent was an engineer, and he went to Houston, Texas. And he was married to Florence, and they had two sons, Norman and Donald. I talked to Donald every month. And then Franklyn. Franklyn was very shy, and he went to Moody Secretarial School and learned how to be a secretary, and became a secretary for the owner of Trumbull Electric, which eventually was bought. It was in Bridgeport, I think, a little town near, well, in Trumbull, Connecticut, and which was eventually sold to General Electric. They made some kind of an electrical fixture for fuse boxes or something. And he was very successful as a secretary. Franklyn and Aunt Hattie, who was Uncle Oscar's wife, Uncle Oscar being the brother of Ernest Buell. And Daisy and Franklyn went to the World's Fair in San Francisco, I believe, in 1936. So the show was going very, very well in Manchester, New Hampshire. And I loved it. And Franklyn and I had made plans to get married. This time I thought I could take it. Franklyn was a different personality from Philip Davis. And when the church reporter on the Springfield Union was on vacation, Franklyn was assigned to cover the churches. And in that, he met very often Dr. John Elmer Wallace, who was the pastor of the First Congregational Church in Springfield at Court Square. Typical Pilgrim, Puritan, New England church. A white steeple, all white church, red carpeting, a balcony, typical New England Protestant church and Pilgrim church that dot the landscape of New England, every state of New England. And so Franklyn wanted Dr. Elmo Wallace to perform the services, and Dr. Elmo Wallace was so good at what he was doing in the Congregational Church before this became the United Church of Christ, that he was given the big, rich parish of First Congregational Church in Wellesley Hills. Roger Babson went to it. That's where the Babson Institute of Finance was. The son went to it. Anyway, it was a rich pew. And so the arrangements were made that Franklyn, well, before that, let me tell you something that Franklyn never lived down. He called Lucy, and Jack wasn't home. And Lucy says, well, is it anything important? And Franklyn said, no. No, he said, I'll call later. Well, he did, and the arrangements were made to get married on Christmas morning in December of 1954. The show at Manchester had ceased. And on a very, very cold, you cannot believe how cold it was. We were united in connubial bliss, conjugal joy, at the First Congregational Church, Wellesley Hills, Massachusetts. And apparently Jack Wallace knew Peter Grimes, who was the owner of the Concord, Massachusetts Inn, famous Lexington Concord. Patriots Day, Paul Revere, one if by land, two if by sea. And Mr. Grimes treated us to dinner as we drove from Wellesley. And then my mother and father went north to Maine to visit their family, and we drove Daisy and Ernest Buell to Terryville. Ernest Buell was a mathematics teacher all of his life. He went to Wesleyan. By the way, he went to Mount Hermon. I believe he had scholarships. He was just a poor farmer boy. Somebody looked out for him. He went to Mount Hermon, and then he went to Wesleyan. High credentials. And Ernest taught in a different town practically every year. Granby, Massachusetts, Torrington, Connecticut, and Franklyn was born in Torrington, Connecticut. And then Ernest Buell, taught school for Martha Berry in Georgia. Martha Berry was a rich plantation lady. She felt sorry for the Woods boys, that they didn't have any education at all. They never had a secondary education, so she started up a school. It was called the Martha Berry Schools. And she was a dynamite at getting people interested in the school and contributing to it. Vis-a-vis Mr. and Mrs. Henry Ford, Mr. and Mrs. Harvey Firestone, and she called those people her pilgrims. And she would have her pilgrims come down and visit the campus. And Ernest, by the way, was teaching mathematics down there. And Franklyn was being homeschooled because he was very shy. But he was playing the trumpet and he was keeping score at the basketball games. And so the backwoods boys did get an education. And on one occasion when Mr. and Mrs. Henry Ford were visiting the campus, Franklyn's father that spring had got a new Dodge. They were always Dodge car fans. And Franklyn's father had this new Dodge, and he drove Mr. and Mrs. Ford around the campus in his new Dodge. Well, then Ernest and Daisy came north. They lived in Middletown around a while. And they settled in Terryville, Connecticut, at 17 Prospect Street, straight up the hill from the Congregational Church. And Ernest was a deacon. Ernest was also a Boy Scout leader. He received in honor the Silver Beaver. And then you knew about Franklyn. He went through D-Day, crossed France, got into Belgium, saw the Yanks coming north, and then instead of going east to Berlin, they were going west to Paris. Well, what happened? What happened was it was a battle of the Bulge, and the weather favored the Germans, and the Yanks couldn't get their supplies in, their reinforcements, and so they were retreating. Then the weather broke, the reinforcements got in. That was the last hurrah of the Germans. Franklyn sat in the English Channel on June the 4th, 1944, because the weather wasn't good enough for the invasion, but it seemed it wasn't going to get better. So on 2 days later, June the 6th, was D-Day. And they just stood up there and got shot down. But they made it. Awful, awful, ugly. And guess what? Franklyn says, you never could have talked me into believing that the war would have been over a year later, but it was. It was over around about June 5th, wasn't it?
There were 13 generals, and the question was, when should D-Day be? And it was supposed to be June the 4th, but the weather was so bad. And the meteorologists predicted that the weather wasn't going to get any better So the 13th general cast the vote, the deciding vote, and that was Dwight Eisenhower.
1945, and the Yanks came home. Franklin didn't have to go to the Pacific, as I told you, because he had so many points. And so he got his honorable discharge. And surely enough, the government came up with a GI Bill. The government issued a GI Bill and paid for his schooling and gave him $21 a month, I believe. And he went to Boston University. He always wanted to be a newspaper reporter. As interested as he was in baseball, he never wanted to be a sports reporter. He wanted to be a general assignment reporter, meeting interesting people and writing interesting stories. Very, very well-written stories. So he went to Boston University, and he went, as many of the veterans did, on the accelerated plan, where you went to college in 3 years instead of 4. You went summers. And Franklin was graduated in 1948. In the first class of the Boston University School of Communications, Department of Journalism. Martin Luther King was a classmate in the School of Theology. Franklin was delighted because he could see Red Sox games. And what field was it? Oh, famous field still goes today.
Fenway Park?
Fenway Park was very near where he roomed.
Field.
And he went through that, and he was still a bachelor. He's pretty old by now, wasn't he? He must have been 30. I think he was 34 when he got married. And that was in 1954. Yes, he was easily 30. It's funny. Well, it isn't funny, but it's certainly interesting and unexpected. So, my mother gave us the apartment on the 3rd floor, and we redecorated it, and we made it beautiful. The living room was red, white, and blue. A navy blue carpet. A small sofa and an overstuffed chair in a red